Okay, we're going to cover for our first assignment in painting Cubism. Cubism is a very good way to learn how to mix your paints, and it's a great art movement and technique. And of course, this was designed by none other than Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque. Uh, these two artists worked together in order to come up with this concept and theory. The young Pablo Picasso will talk a little bit about where he's coming from when he came up with this theory. Now, the young Pablo Picasso here, isn't he cute? He had many, many girlfriends in his life. So, anyhow, we won't get to that part though. That doesn't have to do with our painting. But the young Pablo Picasso was very frustrated in art school because, of course, he was learning traditional art forms, which, of course, is the way the academy taught everyone. That's not a problem. But he had this overactive, uh, anxious mind that wanted to progress farther. He never was much of a realist. Beginning artists tend to try to do things realistically. They're trying to get things right. And for some reason, especially in our Western culture, it's our belief that if we can get things to look just like what we see, we're good. And of course, if we can't get it to look like we see, we're not good. That's an old, old myth in art. And of course, modern art changed a lot of that. And of course, this guy right here had a lot to do with that. Well, he kind of intuitively felt this way when he was younger, but nonetheless, he was in an art school where they were forced to draw and paint these still lifes, which is still a good tool, by the way. I teach that way in my drawing class. Not all of my classes, though. I'd drive my students crazy if I did that in all my classes. One good basic class in drawing from still lifes is enough. Same thing, we'll do a still life in here from painting as well. And one is enough. Some students want to do their whole life in it. Not a problem with that. Other students want to move on. So, of course, Picasso was one of those artists that wanted to move on to other things. So he dropped out of art school. Yeah, he dropped out after the first year, could not stand the academy, and did not feel like he was getting the art training he wanted to. And he was already becoming very popular with the galleries, but of course, the young Picasso, like many young artists, had a big ego. And so that kind of didn't do well for him in many, many instances. So he went through phases. He went through, of course, two world wars, which was, you can imagine, very tough on artists in Europe. So he had, at one time, he had trouble getting paint. So his blue period was basically based on the fact that he got a really good deal on blue paint. So he started working in a monochromatic color scheme. That's what we call monochromatic. And of course, it had to do with the fact that he had this big old box full of blue paint that was a good deal. But it also worked because Picasso, the young Picasso, was poor, and he started identifying with the poor, starving musicians out there in the world. So his blue period is all about, it's very somber, very sullen, and his subject matter was all about some of the suffering that he had to deal with as a young, struggling artist. Now I'm on the internet because a lot of his work is heavily copyrighted, which means I cannot obtain the images and place them online to show you. So we're going to the actual site, pablopicasso.org, especially his rose period. So after the blue period comes the rose period, where he starts identifying with many misfits in society. So these are actually people that travel with the carnival, the circus. So they're already labeled misfits, bearded lady, strange, abnormalities, those kind of things. And these kind of people, oddly enough, if you read anything about P.T. Barnum, he really did a lot of wonderful stuff for these people, even though there was exploitation. He exploited these people by having these, quote, freak shows. This is one of the only places where they all fed in together. Really kind of a sad story, but they love P.T. Barnum because he actually gave them a living, something they really couldn't do because of the way people reacted to the way they looked. So, nonetheless, though, this is one of the things that Picasso, the young Pablo Picasso, identifies with, is these young freak show type people. And so, in his Rose period, again, it's limited in color palette. That's one of the key things about Picasso's work is limited color palettes. He doesn't use the entire rainbow. Okay, limited color palette is already what Picasso is about. So here's another self-portrait of his. You can see him as the little bit older Picasso, but again, in a little bit of a realist style, which is not going to hold his attention and inspiration for long. So he writes to an artist that heavily inspired his work, Paul Cezanne. A lot of people call Cezanne the father of abstract art because, as you can see with this beautiful mountain here, I can't get to it from that way. From this beautiful mountain here, I'm on the internet because a lot of these images are heavily copyrighted. The closer our images come to the 20th century, the harder it is to obtain these. That's why I love places like Wikimedia Commons and the Met, because they do share their images. But anyhow, if you look at this image here, you can see how he's blocking off. That's a key term, blocking off all these colors and structures. So even the mountains looking more triangular than it actually appeared. And you can see this in a lot of Cezanne's work. And of course, Picasso eyed a lot. Look at this one here. Yeah, a lot of blocking off of color. And notice Cezanne, I'm going to see if I can get this one. A lot of these are material sites, which is a shame that they have a copyright to them and nobody else does. So the art corner here, Overstock Art, you can purchase here. So anyhow, but look how blocked off this image is with all the boxes. So geometry, in painting in a basic design class, we studied about organic and geometric images. Cubism is very geometric, very geometric. So you can see here how he's blocking this off. Even the trees become very crude, or actually what's going to become labeled as primitivism. Picasso's earliest works were primitive, by definition, deliberately in a primitive style. And that's kind of important because this is where he gets his inspiration. Yeah, from the African art exhibits. Yeah, and notice in other societies, they've been abstracting the image for centuries. This is an ancient Greek, pre-Greek. The Cyclades culture goes way before the Greek Empire. But a long time ago, they created these figures. You see how blocky and geometric it is? And then even this elongated mask in African art, most of the masks that they created that were deliberately abstracted were abstracted to represent the spirit world. So an abstracted face would represent a spirit, whereas a realistic face would represent a human. So they already had this language going in Africa. Now, how did Picasso see this? Gertrude Stein. Yeah, very famous. There's how she actually looked. That's a photograph of her. So Gertrude Stein was a very famous, well-to-do writer and poet, and she hired the young Picasso to do her self-portrait. Well, but like I said, Picasso dropped out of art school. Here's another great image of her. She was a very influential, great art patron. I love these images together because, well, there's where your story comes from. Uh, Basically, I'm going to scoot this in so we can see both. So basically, Picasso, since he didn't get the training in realism that he intended to get, this is why I offer one class where we have to do realism, because those skills are important. It certainly hurt him here because basically what happened was Picasso could not get her face right. See how it looks like this, almost like she's wearing a mask here. That's how many times he painted over it, blotted it out, painted over it again, blotted it out. He got the background and all the wonderful textures fine. So it all blends together, but her face kind of looks like It's cut out and pasted on. That's how many times he worked this image, and he could not get her likeness. It's very hard to do that in portraiture, capture someone's likeness. It might be a twitch of the nose or a change in the eyes or that kind of thing. Nonetheless, Picasso, out of sheer frustration, he gives up on it, sets it aside, and takes off to go on vacation. While he's on vacation, he actually sees an exhibit on African art, and it's like an explosion in his head. He realizes that it's the Western world that judged people by how the likeness of their paintings were, but other cultures and other societies had a completely different interpretation of how art should be. So he comes back with just this exciting uh, inspiration for painting. And of course, that's when he paints in her face. Of course, that was kind of good because Gertrude Stein's a little bit fed up with him at this point because she's been waiting on this commission. So she's no longer available to sit for him. So now he's forced to finish the painting without her in front of him. No photography, no pictures. He's got to paint from memory. And of course, his inspiration from African art, he decides, okay, I can do this from memory. It doesn't have to look exactly like her. So several people looked at this image. I like this image right here because it really does show that it didn't look much like her. So people looked at the image of her and the image of the actual image of Gertrude Stein and said, gee, it doesn't look like her. Picasso was such a great salesperson, he would argue, well, someday she'll look like that. And he let it go at that. So that really opened an entire avenue of thinking for Picasso because now he understood that art did not have to represent what we saw in front of us. It could be highly interpretive. Around this time, he meets his friend Georges Braque. This is Georges Braque's work here. And they start developing their theories on analytical cubism. Of course, they didn't have the name for cubism at that time. They actually got the term cubism from an art critic who looked at this work. He wasn't very flattering about it. He said, looks like tiny little cubes. And they liked that. So the name stuck. That's where they get cubism. Now there's analytical cubism and synthetic cubism. Synthetic cubism has to do more with 3D and collages and assemblages. We're going to stick with paint and learn how to mix our paints. So when you're dealing with cubism, these are the rules, the basic rules that you need to understand. So neutral colors. Notice the colors that I will have out in the classroom and the colors, if you want to go and just buy your paints in different sections, then you're going to want to get Payne's Gray. You're going to want to get yellow ochre. You're going to want to get raw sienna. You're going to get raw umber, burnt umber, and some I think that's about all I've got there. So anyhow, these are very neutral tones. So if you want to think about it intellectually, the Payne's Gray would be your blue. The yellow ochre would be, of course, your yellow. And then the raw umber would be your reds, your burnt umber and your raw umber and your raw sienna and your burnt sienna. That's the other color. And your burnt sienna. And like I said, if you get one or two of those are fine. I've got a few supplied in the classroom. And if you find some of these tubes at home, try to get raw sienna, burnt umber, raw umber, Payne's Gray. These are actual paints that were created at the same time that Georges Braque and Picasso were alive. So these are tried and true formulas that you want to get. So when you buy your paints, try to get as close to that name as possible. I know with these popular hobbyist shops, they're really not interested in academia, so they may not have some of these, which is why I've got some paints provided in the classroom. But limited supply, so you really do need to get your own paints. but try to get these colors, these tones, because it's very important with traditional cubism. We're going to try to go traditional in this manner. It's very important that you get with the neutral tones. That's one of the things that cubism was all about, was neutral tones. See, and look at the variation. These are the same neutral tones. You've got Payne's gray here, you got burnt sienna, you got yellow ochre. But look at the, depending on which paint you grab at which time, you get a completely different composition and a completely different style. Now, with cubism, the rules here, they're not interested in a sense of space here. Yeah, there's very little dimension. There are different cubes though. So you have a light and a dark cube like you would draw in a basic still life class. So there is objects here. Here we see a figure. Here we see a violin. And several other, a candle, and so there are other objects. So one of the key things about cubism is they didn't get rid of the objects. It's not non-representational. There's actually representations of objects in here. But what they've done is split it in half. Like they'll show an edge of a violin and maybe the neck of the violin. And over here they might show the base of the violin. In the figure here, you might see part of the head here or one of the arms here, but then you'll also see the figure in profile. So those are very common things with cubism, is they'll have multiple views, not the same view, but they'll have multiple views in the same painting. So you'll see a side view and a front view in one. There's very little dimension in space, even though there is space. It is blocked off to different spaces. So the easiest way to go about this is to get like an index card or some mat board and use it as a stencil and paint to get nice sharp edges. You don't have to have perfectly sharp edges. You can see these are not very sharp, but at the same time, it helps you get one color with shading lights and darks next to the other. So your first assignment, you're basically going to be painting a cubist. I want you to try little paintings first. Those are your little thumbnails. You're going to work out your ideas before you jump into a big painting, like an 18 by 24 or 16 by 20 painting is what we're looking for. 16 inches by 20 inches or 18 inches by 24 inches. So we're looking for something like that for this assignment. So if you look at cubism today, they've gone way off the general idea. You can see they're not really sticking with the general forms today. We want to stick with, this one looks traditional, the history of cubism. Makes sense, it'd be on a history site. But today they've really taken liberties and gone all over. But traditional cubism, look at that color scheme again, sticks with these neutral tones. And you can get some beautiful, here we got another violin here. So you can get some beautiful tones with cubism. Yeah, so analytical cubism is what we're doing here. So try out some ideas. This is wonderful. It's a good way to mix colors. So you're going to be mixing your ochres and your Payne's grays. We're going to use titanium white as our lightning color and Payne's gray as our blues, our tones, our cool tones, and as our darkening color. So use Payne's gray to darken other colors, and you can also use it as just a general range of colors itself. So limited color palettes, yes, you are going to choose an object, but you're going to split that object and show maybe half of it here, half of it there. You're going to move it around, show it in profile and show it facing forward, kind of like this crazy teddy bear here. That's kind of cute. So anyhow, have fun with this. I do have demonstrations in class as well.